RAAF is the second oldest air force and at the forefront of aviation for over a century. Be inspired by our remarkable air crew, maintenance personnel and support personnel who work tirelessly to keep our aircraft flying high and our skies secure. Host Gareth McRae, OAM, explores stories of humble men and women who, with daring and courage, established the Air Force as an Australian icon.
Air Chief Marshal Retired Mark Binskin AC is a highly decorated and respected senior executive and leader in the national security, defence and aerospace sectors. Most recently, he was Chief of the Defence Force of Australia from 2014 to 2018, earlier as Vice Chief of the Defence Force 2011 to 2014, and Chief of Air Force 2008 to 2011. He currently has appointments to senior positions with many defence-related organisations. As Chief of the Defence Force, Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin successfully led the Australian Defence Force, comprising 80,000 permanent and reserve personnel, to significantly improve capabilities and responses to major global events, and championed organisational change across areas of national security, culture, diversity and leadership performance. He oversaw the first Principles Review of Defence and delivered the successful implementation of the One Defence approach. Mark Binskin has provided specialist advice to the highest levels of governments, industry leaders and international stakeholders, and his aerospace knowledge and expertise is extensive. He has over 3,500 hours in single-seat fighter aircraft, including the A4G Skyhawk, Mirage 3, F-16C and FA-18 Hornet. He continues to be active in general aviation, is a Warbird owner and holds commercial, remote and recreational aviation Australian pilot licenses. Mark has completed the Harvard Business School Advanced Management Program, is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and a Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. Air Chief Marshal Retired Mark Binskin AC, it is great to have your time. How are you today?
Thanks, Gareth. Retirement's a figment of my imagination, but it's good to be able to talk to you. I'm starting to sound like my wife.
Oh, please. The moment you retire that's when things go downhill. So whatever you do not retire. And actually, like, a silly place to start, maybe, but I'd like to talk about your father. Tell me about your father. What was his role with the Air Force and how did he influence you?
He, from a young age, always wanted to fly, and I think he always wanted to be the Air Force. He never got a chance to realise that. But as young as I can remember, I remember him flying. We would go to air shows, we would do all that sort of stuff. So as long as I can remember back to 3 or 4, it had an influence on me always wanting to fly myself. He did actually end up serving. He ended up serving as a corporal in the Army Reserve in water transport. I got to go out a couple of times with him on landing craft. I got to participate as a Hornet pilot in an exercise in Twofold Bay one year when we attacked them as they were doing all their going ashore from HMAS Tobruk. And in probably the mid-80s when I was at 2OCU, because he was a member of the Army Reserve, I was allowed to take him for a fly on a Hornet, which was one of those special moments in my life.
That is a special moment. You grew up in Campbelltown, I believe. Did you go to a high school in Campbelltown?
So I grew up in Campbelltown. I went to Campbelltown Central Public School. I had some great teachers then. Then when I went to high school, I went to Hurlston Agricultural High School, which a fair few people from my school went to.
Was there a cadet unit at Hurlston Ag?
Yeah, but it was an Army cadet unit. In the meantime, I actually went to 3 flight at Camden as an Air Force cadet. And that was a Friday night. And we used to get on a bus and go across there. The bus came from Liverpool, went all the way out to Camden, and then dropped everyone else back on the way back. Unfortunately, that was the time where the Whitlam government decided to take away all the funding for cadets. And it got very hard there, but through some very strong work from parents, of which my dad was one of them, we would still go backwards and forwards. So the parents ended up transporting us backwards and forwards in people movers and all that. And despite people's best efforts, the cadet units actually thrived.
You went to Hurlston Ag, which is a very prestigious school. I'm not trying to match it, but I went to Canterbury Boys High School, and there was both... I think
we used to play you in basketball and rugby.
Yes, I know. We kept on winning. Anyway, moving right along, there was both an Army and an ATC unit at Canterbury Boys High School. I was part of the ATC, and I remember that the people in charge of that, when Whitlam did it, they were most upset that he took the funding away. But be that as it may, if you did go to Hurlston Ag, as I said, a very prestigious high school, you went through to the final year of high school, yes?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
So was there another career path that you had thought about on graduation?
Not on graduation, probably around the end of year 10. I did toss up wanting to go and do computer programming and get into IT. But to be honest with you, that was brief, and that would have been a fallback had I not got into the services. But at the time, as you do as a cocky 17-year-old, you don't actually ever think about what happens if you don't get what you apply for or whatever. So I was pretty lucky, and I look back at now and see that I was very privileged to be able to get selected into the services, Navy initially, but a lot of that had to do with the support from my parents as well.
Okay, now I read a couple of times about your referring to 2 Mirages that flew overhead. When was that? How old were you? And the fact that you say the pilot looked at you, that sounds pretty awesome. Tell me about that.
Yeah. I was young. I would have been about 6 or 7, I think, somewhere around about that age. I remember we used to live on the outskirts of Campbelltown. It's the centre of Campbelltown now, but used to be in the outskirts, a place called Bottle Avenue, which is up on a hill. And we came home one day. I can't remember what we were doing. I'd just gotten out of the back of the car and heard the roar and looked around, and whether they were doing a fly past or they were positioning to run into Holsworthy or do something like that, they actually came past just slightly higher than us standing on the hill. And I remember it because one of the jets was silver, which shows you how long ago that was. And I do remember the number 2 jet, the pilot was sort of glancing right. They were in a combat formation as they came past, just glancing right, and I happened to be looking at them the time that he glanced right. So, yeah, it's still in my mind, to be honest with you. It still gives me goosebumps remembering it.
They were close enough for you to actually see the pilot.
Yeah, they weren't that far away. It was memorable because it was before we ended up then going to Silver Jubilee air shows that were running. Would have been 1971, wasn't it? So it was well before that because that was my next memory, Richmond, watching the Mirages pitch into the circuit and land at Richmond at the air show.
What was most memorable about it? Was it the sound of the jets, or the 2 jets together, or the pilot being able to see the pilot? What was memorable about the incident?
The whole bit. Because it was unexpected, I think, was just the fact that hearing the noise of the first jet, looking around and seeing the second jet go past, and just the whole experience was what was memorable.
So did that moment burn in your psyche, that's what I want to do?
I think I actually wanted to do it before that, fly, but probably fly fighters. That would have been the moment. Richmond Air Show in 71 was the one. And the other one was Nowra used to run air shows as well. So Campbelltown was easy to get to Nowra. And watching the A4s do their display I think the A4 display was the one more so than the Mirages that really got me inspired to want to fly fighters.
I find it interesting that a man who wants to fly joins the Navy. Settle my confusion. Why the Navy first?
Interesting. So one of the aeroplanes that inspired me was the A4. The Mirage did as well, but the F4 did. And back then, lots of F4 shots, not so much in Air Force, but F4s doing carrier work as well. The Royal Navy flew the F4. So you saw photos of them and what they were doing. I used to make models of A4s and F4s and land them on my desk and all that sort of stuff. So there was a carrier part always, I guess, inspired me, gave me lots of energy to think about it and go, boy, I wish I could do that. And then when I finished high school, my mum and dad paid for me to be able to do up to my restricted pilot's licence at the time. So I went and flew over in Camden at VH Aviation. The chief flying instructor over there was an ex-Sea Fury pilot, a guy by the name of Ken Andrews, who was still flying when he was 102. I think he's still around. I saw a photo of him last year or the year before doing something at Bankstown. So talking to him and watching his professionalism when he was instructing was very impressive. And then when I finished that, I was going through the process of recruiting, which was much simpler back then. But I went through the process of recruiting. I briefly had a job at Downs department store in Campbelltown as a cadet. There you go, cadet in the hardware store. At about week 6, they decided hardware wasn't for me, and I decided hardware wasn't for me too. And I got stuck into the process of recruiting. I remember going with Dad to the Air Force recruiter, and they kept wanting me to go to the academy, and I kept saying, I want to go to the academy. I'm sure there's this thing called direct entry, to which the recruiter finally said, yeah, actually there is. Here's the paperwork for that. And at the same time applying for aircrew entry, direct entry into Navy. And I got the response back within a day, Navy and Air Force. And the first one I got back was Navy. And I remember my mum tells the story, I walk around the house trying to go, is this really what I want to do? Or I got more chance in Air Force or whatever. In the end, I took the Navy as the way I wanted to go, because that was, from a passion and emotion point of view, that was the one that always got me, and was something I always wanted to do. Little did I know it wasn't that easy, but it was something I always wanted to do.
If flying was your passion, surely the Air Force would have given you a greater diversity of experiences flying than the Navy, which is only one experience. You take off and land on an aircraft carrier.
Yeah, that's got a bit of adrenaline running with it, though, let me tell you.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
I'll tell you what, though, if Air Force still had F4 Phantoms at the time, I probably would have gone Air Force just from that emotion point of view. But the A4 and the Mirage, I'm not sure why I went that way. I think it was just the chance to do some carry work, I think was it. Yeah. And I love the A4 as an aeroplane.
So someone listening to you right now who has gone through a recruitment process today, can you just tell us what kinds of questions and what kinds of things you were asked in the process of applying?
Yes, all the standard stuff. You know, what's your motivation? Why do you want to do it? Why do you think you can do it? Why should Navy or why should Air Force bring you on? They also went through the, if we didn't offer you a pilot, would you take NAV or would you take seaman officer or whatever? And to be honest with you, when they asked me that question, I was very honest back with them, saying, no, I actually want to be a pilot. That's why I want to do it, which then they put that question away. So all that, but motivation, and then looking for what's your energy, your motivation, what's your leadership skills, what do you bring, what's your personal character, because all that's important. Can you work as a team or not? So we went through a lot of that, and then we went to the board and they did similar questions.
So now training, you get in, you've okay, I'm now going to join the Navy. You said a moment ago, didn't realise how difficult it would be. What were some of the difficulties? How difficult was training? Training
was difficult because, first of all, we went to Creswell for 6 weeks. It was very short. It was called BATC, Basic Aircrew Training Course, I think. So we were down there briefly, and then we went to Point Cook, where we joined up with our Air Force cadre, because we did the flying training jointly. And I think there were 11 Navy aircrew that were there, and I think the course itself would have been 60 on course. Might have been 44. I have to go back and have a look at the numbers. But it's only then that you realise the pass rate's actually quite low. Relatively, only 50% of you are going to get through, and that was about what it was. My Navy course, we started with 11 and graduated 5. The Air Force course, might have been the Air Force part, was 44. They graduated about 20 or 22, something like that. So we were running what was a normal statistic. It's something you've got to dedicate yourself to, because when you're flying, A, it's a very unforgiving environment. But B, you fail a ride, you'll get a re-ride, and then after that you'll go to a board and they'll assess whether you've got potential to continue or not. So there's not a lot of margin for error or taking your eye off the ball over that 18 months that you're doing your flying training as a pilot.
And in the flying training, is it Navy pilots doing the training, or are they using Air Force instructors to do the training?
So it was a mix. So you had a number of Navy instructors at Point Cook and a number of Navy instructors at Pearce, but majority were Air Force. Most of my training was with Air Force instructors. I flew occasionally with the Navy senior naval officer or a Navy instructor, but they just matched them up with various cadets and midshipmen at the time. There was nothing about, as Navy, you flew with Navy pilots and Air Force pilots.
But even then, and I'm not meaning to date you, but even then there was cross-fertilisation between the two services.
Oh, for sure. That's exactly right. even today, Navy do the full Air Force course, pretty much the full Air Force course, and the reason being, even though they don't fly fighters, they fly helicopters, single pilot IFR over water at night, low level. So they do that so that they get the full single pilot skills that pilot's course gives you. Different thing, but maybe Army should.
Yeah. What clearly is a very long, wondrous and illustrious career, you obviously have come in contact with many sorts of people. Can you tell me something about some of the people you've met and the influences they've had on your career?
Yeah, I've had the benefit of some great leaders. I really have. Through the Navy, there was a couple of leaders in the squadrons. A guy named Clive Blennerhassett, Gary Northern, Barry Daly, Peter Clark was an ex-Hilo guy that had flown A4s. Very, very good pilots and very good leaders, I thought, of the squadrons, good mentors in the squadrons. And then when I went across to Air Force, again, having the privilege of working with some really great leaders, John Kindler, Al Tithridge, and those ilk, Gary Gent at the time at 77. When a midshipman arrived into a Mirage squadron, could have made life hard. In fact, they didn't. I was just treated as if I was an Air Force pilot. In fact, I was in a squadron with pilots that I'd been on pilot's course with, so it just sort of transferred across. And then one of the best CEOs I had was a US Air Force CEO when I was on exchange with the US Air Force, a guy by the name of Steve Haynes. All great leaders and mentors that I could rely on to give me good advice. And when I started to veer as a bog rat the wrong way, slap me about and point me back in the right direction, which is what it's all about.
As what eventually becomes the Chief of Defence, namely you, what would you say are 3 or 4 things that from all those people that had an influence on you most influenced you as a leader?
Lead from the front is one. You've also got to walk the talk. You've got to have street cred when you're leading. But lead from the front, compassion. Make the right calls. It doesn't mean that you're not firm, but understand the people that you have working with you. Make the right calls. If they start to veer, mentoring, just nothing like just sort of dragging someone aside and having a bit of a quiet chat. But making sure that you don't get a motive over something, you actually look at something with the facts that are there. And then I think good traits as a leader, I learned as a fighter pilot, which you can't do everything yourself. People talk about fighter pilots being loners. They're not actually. They're very good team players, because when you're out there with 16 aeroplanes tearing around the sky, everyone has to know what everyone else does, and you have to be trusted to do your part. And if you can't, put your hand up and say something. So I took that and what I learned as a fighter combat instructor all the way through my career. I'd be quite happy delegating something to someone, a task, checking up on them occasionally. They would make sure that they would report back. If they needed help, they'd come back and let me know. If not, I'd trust them to do it. I would not necessarily say that I was the expert in the room on everything. I would always be quite happy, even when we were talking in national security circles, of going to the expert to be able to provide that little bit of extra advice if government needed or someone else needed it. And so having that confidence as a leader, not to have to do everything yourself, but you are bringing that orchestra together and making sure they're working.
That makes sense. As a leader, what are some of the things that are most difficult to do as a leader?
Probably the hardest for me as a leader, there are a lot of hard things. One is giving full and frank advice to a government, and then understanding that there is a government position when you're working it, and making sure that whenever you're shaping something, that the government understands how you're coming forward, but also understand they're working in their own imperatives. So that at the highest level was hard to do. Not impossible, but you just had to understand the different angles. And when you bring that down, you understand that not everyone thinks the same way. Not everyone talks the same language. So when you're talking to people and you're looking at moving forward in something or trying to direct, you have to put in the language that they understand. Especially when you're in the joint environment, the 3 services don't necessarily talk the same language. So you have to, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. That's the advantage of being joint, not being the same. And then you work a public service in there as well, which use a different language as well. It's always hard when you're trying to counsel someone who's not doing the right thing. That is one of the hardest things, especially if that's a friend that you're sitting and sort of talking to and working with. That is always difficult to do. It's hard when you lose people, to be honest with you. It always hits you personally. but it's something that you need to take it and then be able to move on and not get bogged down. It sounds very cold, but it's not. It doesn't mean that you don't take it personally, you don't learn from losing people around you, but that was always difficult, especially when that was mates. And if you look at my first couple of years in flying, I think we were doing a funeral every 6 months for a friend. That was not the way aviation should be, but that was what was happening.
How does that weigh on you as a person?
It doesn't weigh on you. It means that you don't make decisions lightly. When I was CDF, I never made decisions lightly, or recommendations to government, never took them lightly when we were putting people in harm's way. We always made sure that we tried to cover every aspect where we could. But at the end of the day, operations are dangerous things, but you try and minimise the risk to your people as best you could. And I think I learnt that through the flying game. It doesn't mean that you don't do risky things, but it does mean that you manage that risk as best you can before you then attempt that activity.
I'll come back in a moment to Chief of Air Force and also Chief of Defence, but let's just on a lighter note go back to the Navy and let's revisit your very first landing on an aircraft carrier. And before you go to that, I've never been in a jet, obviously, and experienced that speed. But I have been in a car, a racing car, with a competent driver around Bathurst, going down Conrod Strait, touching 300 kilometres per hour, and I know what speed feels like. So having set that as a backdrop, you're now in a thing that goes faster than that, and you're going to land on a little tin boat, ship.
Yeah, it's I call them a boat, but Chief of Navy has always pulled me up and say they're a ship. I never did a cruise on the ship, unfortunately, and we can talk about why that was. We lost a couple of aeroplanes on a cruise where I was back on VC 724. But we did the day carrier qual, and then we kept carrier currency, even when decisions were going backwards and forwards on what they would do with Melbourne. But the first carrier landing, I remember it was a Friday lunchtime where we went out, the 3 aircraft went out to the ship. There was a senior student on course, the 3 of us on course that had graduated, and this slot came up. First of all, by the way, we did weeks and weeks and weeks of training for it, and a thing called FCLP, Field Carrier Landing Practice. And inevitably you'd do it at night, you'd get airborne and you'd do 6 or 8 touch and goes at night at Nowra onto the painted deck using the mirror landing system, which we always used, with a LSO, landing signals officer, out there who was also A4 qualified. It's not as if they said just launch the ship and away you go. There was a lot of training and a lot of preparation.
Are these in the A4 Skyhawks? Is that what you're talking? Yeah, right, okay.
In the A4 Skyhawk. And bring me back to this in a minute, because it gets back to the managing the risk, and it's understanding what you're sending people to do. You couldn't land the 2-seat A4 on the ship. Its centre of gravity, I think, was too far forward. It was a slightly longer jet. And if you did a long bolter, i.e. you touched down long on the deck, they weren't guaranteeing you get the nose back up again before you sailed off the end. Okay. So it was always, the first carrier landing was you're in a single-seater on your own. So we did a lot of work up, and senior pilot signed us all off, and the landing signals officer signed us off as ready to go, and out we went. And there was guy by the name of Rob Bradshaw, who was the the RN exchange guy, helicopters, training on A4s, to fly A4s and then go back and fly Sea Harriers. Myself and I think it was Paul Cuts-Calati. And out we went. And 805 Squadron was on board at the time. A couple of guys that had been on course were with 805 on the ship. They were about 50 or 60 miles out to sea off Point Perpendicular. And we arrived overhead. We went out. It wasn't a great day. It was a little bit grey, bit of a swell, and we were orbiting overhead about 3,000 or 4,000 feet. And I looked down and thought, "Jesus, that thing looks small." And they launched 4 A4s off the deck from 805 Squadron to go to Beecroft Range to do a bombing mission while we were doing our circuit training on the ship. And I thought, geez, that looks a bit small. Anyway, we closed up into close formation and went overhead the deck at about 600 feet. When you line up and you sort of run in and pitch into the circuit, about 20-second separation. And I looked down at 600 feet and I thought, gee, it's still looking a bit small down there.
This was the HMAS Melbourne, yes?
HMAS Melbourne. So lined up on downwind, put the gear down. The first couple were going to be touch and goes, not arrested landings. So I was on downwind as the number 1 and 2 jets did their thing, and looked over at the ship, and it still looked small. And then came around the pattern and rolled out on finals, and it still looks small. And down we went, and I touched down somewhere on the deck, got airborne and went again and went around, and I must have been pretty okay with it because the call from the air group commander was hooked down.
So your first run in is you actually touch down with the wheels on the deck of the aircraft carrier and then take off again.
Yep. So your touchdown is a touch and go. So you touch, it actually the first one happened in very quick time. After you got used to it, it's actually in your mind, temporarily it was quite slow. But touched down and got airborne, and I thought, wow, that was pretty small, because as you touch, all these faces go past, the people standing on the deck, and you're airborne again. And the CAG said hook down, so I put the hook down. And
the hook down is that attached to the A4, is it?
Yes, so at the back of the A4 you got the hook that comes down there, the arrestor hook. And Melbourne had 5 wires across the deck for you to catch, and I can't remember, it wasn't that far from the back of the ship to the first wire. I think it was only 20 or 30 feet, not that much. And the touchdown area was only a couple of 100 feet as well.
Roughly how many feet per second are you coming in at?
Oh, yeah, good point. Now we're going back. We would have been about 120 knots, so that's about 200 kilometres an hour. The ship's steaming at maybe 15 or 20 knots, then you've probably got another 5 or 10 knots over the deck. So actually your ground speed is back around about 80. And then downwind with the hook down, feel a little bit more confident now, and rolling out on finals. And Melbourne used to roll as well as pitch. So in that swell, the thing's rolling, and so the mirror system didn't work as well as it would if it was just a pitching or a steady deck. So the landing signals officer is giving you some good corrections, a little bit high, a little bit low, a bit power and all that, and they'll talk you down while you're using the mirror landing system as well.
What is the mirror landing system?
Okay, so mirror landing system, you can see that. So you've got lights that would go, I'll use my head here too, lights that are either side of a ball that gets projected onto a mirror.
Okay.
And if that ball goes high on those lights, if you use my head as the ball, you're high. If it goes low, that's bad because you're low, and you're trying to keep it lined up the whole time. You're maintaining what's called on-speed angle of attack, which is the angle of the jet, the nose, and the angle of attack of the airflow to the wing. And so that gives you a good hook clearance to be able to pick up the wire as you come.
Is it the intention to pick up the first of those 5 wires across?
No, it's actually pick up the 4th, believe it or not. So the aim point is the 4th wire, the 3rd or 4th wire. I think it's the 4th wire. I got the 1st wire, so I was a bit low on my first trap, but felt good. Just touched down into the wire. The next sensation you get is here you are, you're going up and down, left and right, because the ship's going through the swell. Totally unnatural in an aeroplane, but you don't get a chance to think about it much because there's lots of hand movements and waving. They're trying to get you clear of the landing area to get the next aeroplane down, and you don't have much time to think about it because they strap you on the catapult and then shoot you straight off again to do it again.
My understanding of Newton's law of physics is that a body in motion wishes to continue in motion. So you, the pilot in the plane, you've come to a dead stop. What does your head then hit the cockpit screen, or what happened? No,
you're strapped in pretty tight and you've got your harness locked. That's one of the things you do as a check. But you do get thrown forward quite markedly. And then as you taxi onto the catapult, and they strap the wire to you to launch you off the catapult, and that was the impressive part. The landing was impressive, but the catapult shot was only about a 90-foot shot, so that's about just over 30 metres. And you went 0 to probably 90 knots in that time.
Wow.
That was very, very impressive. And then they shot you off and you went round again. I think we did that 5 times, that mission, and then by then the other jets were coming back from Beecroft, and we cleaned up and went back to Nowra to land.
From that description, Mark, landing and taking off from an aircraft carrier would be the greatest challenge for any pilot. That's challenging, surely.
It was. What was interesting, I was 20. Go back to the risk bit. I harp back on that because I look at it in later life and go, I wouldn't give my kids the keys to my car at 20. And here we are out there landing what is quite a high-speed jet on the world's smallest carrier deck at the time. the bit I harp back on is they would never have let us do it unless they felt we were qualified for it, we were trained, we understood the risks, and they had worked us up to that level.
That bespeaks the quality of the training in the Defence Forces, particularly Air Force, that before I let you loose with my car keys, you are trained to the absolute limit of what I can do, and I know you're capable.
And I know I can trust you to stay within your limits. So there's that other part, which is that trust as well, because you could be trained for it, and if you didn't have the right psyche for that job, you could quite easily go outside the bounds of what you're authorised to do. So it's all part of how we train people, but then how we trust them to do the jobs within the skills and the authorisation that they have.
Would I be correct in saying your decision to leave the Navy and join the Air Force is because the government decided to scrap fixed wing components?
Yeah, so at the end of 2.5 years flying the A4, towards the end of that, the very first exchange between Air Force and Navy occurred. And we've been flying A4s and Mirages for, 15 years? Up until then, there had never been an exchange between Air Force and Navy. So finally, they'd got an exchange. I ended up being selected as the first Navy pilot to go and fly Mirages on exchange. And a guy by the name of Gary Standen was the Mirage pilot who came and flew A4s. My intent was always to go away, fly Mirages for 2 years at 77 Squadron. It was a posting directly to 77. And then come back, and I wanted to do an air warfare instructor's course and continue to fly A4s and then go into whatever replacement it was. So at that stage, it was looking more like it would probably be Sea Harriers or AVA-B plus type Harriers. That was sort of the thinking that everyone was having. I started flying Mirages, and early on in that, about 6 months into it, which was the course, I started to talk to the Air Force Command about maybe at the end of my time, there was a fighter combat instructor course coming up, and staying and doing that for 6 months as a Navy pilot, and then going back and flying A4s, then taking that full skill set back. But while I was on exchange, there was a few interesting things occurred. Falklands, 1982. That was while I was still training. And then the government of the day decided that they wouldn't buy Invincible, which had been offered, and I think they were ready to purchase. And so that worked for the Royal Navy, but it also worked for the Australian government at the time. I think was looking for a way to get out of this. So they decided not to do it, and then announced they would disband the fixed wing part of the Fleet Air Arm, because obviously they still needed helicopters and the like. And then would look to transition the fixed-wing pilots somehow. So most of my cadre went to the Royal Navy and flew Sea Harriers. I was on exchange, so by the time we got to the point where we were starting to change over, I was a B category Mirage pilot. I was tactical reconnaissance qualified. But believe it or not, I couldn't just change over. It was made quite difficult at the time, and there was a lot of angst between Air Force and Navy, as you would expect. So I actually had to go back through recruiting to get to the Air Force. So now here I am flying Mirage, but I had to go back and put in applications through recruiting. So I remember we were on exercise in Darwin at the time. Might have been a pitch black exercise in 1983, and I got the response for my application for the Royal Australian Air Force, and it basically went along the lines of, Mr. Binskin, thank you for your application to join the Royal Australian Air Force. At the moment, there are no vacancies for people of your qualifications. That's paraphrasing, but that was what it was. I thought, wow, Air Force is pretty strict. I'm a BCAT Mirage pilot, tactical reconnaissance qualified, and that ain't enough. So the CO at the time, I think, was Gary Jen. I don't think Tiff had taken over at that stage. I showed him this correspondence, and he said, that's bullshit, give that to me. And I thought he screwed it up and walked out. In fact, I remember we were in the bar at Darwin at the time when I read it. So I thought, this is going to be harder. Anyway, over a couple of months, they worked it. Believe it or not, I started fighter combat instructor's course as a sub-lieutenant. I was 2 months into that course when I went to Sydney one day, got out of Navy, and the next day got into Air Force and went back and finished the course as an Air Force pilot.
Unbelievable.
But you like this, as CO 77 Squadron, a few years later, the admin staff were in cleaning out the archives in the safe, and I was in my office, which was right next to that. I hear this, oh, wow, look at this. And in comes one of the staff with the letter. So that letter is now in my archives.
Yeah.
But it was just interesting that it popped up again a few years later.
But I've got to ask, just as an aside, a silly question. In your first experience in the Mirage, did it bring back memories of the two Mirages you saw as a kid?
Yeah, it did. I'd actually been in one when I was on pilot's course. They had come across to Pierce for an exercise and they were doing dual rides, and my instructor at the time was Bill Johnson, who was our instructor over there, wide body. And he organised for me to get a backseat ride in the two-seat Mirage. So I'd already had a chance to fly it and thought, this is impressive. So I knew what I was in for. But to be honest with you, I felt a bit daunted going there, because here I am, it's the first ever exchange between a Navy and Air Force. I go, I can't screw this up. But once I jumped in the jet, I felt comfortable quite quickly. I could hold my own basic fighter manoeuvring and air-ground attacks and all that. I had to learn to work the radar and do all that. But the A4 prepared me quite well for it. And I think I brought some things to it as well with slightly different thinking. But I enjoyed the course and then really enjoyed the 18 months at 77 Squadron.
You've flown, correct me if there's more than I'm going to say, you've flown the A4, you've flown the Mirage, you've flown, I believe, an F-16C, you've flown the FA-18 Hornet. Of all those planes, which gave you the most pleasure?
The one I was strapped into at the time. It depended. I'll be honest with you. If I was going to war, I'd take the F-18 any day. It was a pilot's machine. Ergonomically, it was really good. The interface with the cockpit, the layout in the cockpit, how you got the information and the like to fly it, it was a joy. Two engines came in handy, but the manoeuvrability of it was something else. And it was a robust aeroplane. So if I was going to war, that would be the aeroplane I would have taken. The A4 from a pure pilot's aeroplane was absolutely beautiful to fly. Heinemann, when he designed it, did a fantastic job with that aeroplane. It could carry a lot and it could go a long, long way. The Mirage, there were some great times I remember in the Mirage, running low level at Townsville with 4 bombs on those Israeli drop tanks in the centre line and running to a target. Some of those memories are fantastic. And some of the air-to-air fights where you're high and you're fast didn't turn well. You had one good turn and then you were slow and or spectacular. But it was a good aeroplane. And to be honest with you, in Air Force's history, it's been a forgotten aeroplane. I know there's a bit of a push out there at the moment to try and get the Mirage's history up because it played a fantastic role in Cold War. You remember we had 2 squadrons at Butterworth. We were in Singapore a lot with 5-power defence range. So it did a lot, but it doesn't get a lot because it was overshadowed by the B-111. So it probably needs its story told, to be honest with you, because it was a great aeroplane. Technology-wise, it was years ahead of its time when you look at the technology, the radar and everything. The Mirage got sold to Pakistan. We because the decision to replace Mirage got delayed, we had to re-wing all the aeroplanes. Then we put R550 Matra Magic infrared missiles on it. We still had the old 530 radar missile. But at the end of the time, Pakistan bought them. And believe it or not, as CDF, when I visited Pakistan, I visited one of our ex-Mirage squadron that was operating our ex-Mirages, which was quite interesting. They put a few more modifications in them, but they were quite proud to show me what they had done.
Tell me about your time with 77 Squadron.
77 was good. It was a good cadre. It was a good squadron. We were the only Mirage squadron in Australia at the time. The other 2, 3 and 75 were in Butterworth. So we got a lot of tasking. We moved around a lot. I remember going to New Zealand on the deployment. My first BCAT long-range mission was to lead 4 aircraft to New Zealand for an air show. So we got to fly over there. That was interesting with weather and wind and everything. We did a few deployments to Learmont, Darwin, Townsville. We got around. I mean, it was a nice aeroplane to fly. It had plenty of performance. I could see how some people were daunted by it. In the circuit, to land it, you were fast. In fact, the threshold speed, you came across the threshold, I think about 175 knots from memory, which is quite fast. So I could see how back people had only flown Sabres and all the way up and transition Mirage. It would have been quite daunting for them to get into an aeroplane that you're max performing in the circuit area. I remember getting airborne at Townsville, 4 bombs with a centerline tank, and you're lifting off at about 195 or 200 knots, which is about 380 kilometres an hour. So you're whistling down the runway by the time you get it airborne. Then you have to keep it low to accelerate, and then once you got the airspeed on it and drag off the wing, it went, and it went really well. So I really enjoyed flying it. It was a time where we started to try and maximise its capability, and we started to bring back the radar missile and its employment and all that, because we were getting ready to step into the Hornet, and we knew we needed to change our thinking on how we were operating it. So it was a good time, but it was the people in the squadron, the maintainers, a good bunch. It was a good time, again, as a young fighter pilot. And then it was a privilege to be able to go and do the fighter combat instructor course in it. And some of the things we were doing in it, we tell people now and they just shake their heads, because we were taking the aeroplane to its maximum capability. And unfortunately, we lost people doing it.
Tell me about
where we took it too far. Yeah.
Tell me about your role with both Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom.
Yeah, okay. So this is an interesting one. I was back doing Hornet conversion, not Hornet refresher at Williamtown. I had come out of the AWC project, and Angus Houston had asked me to do a review for a year on promotion to one star on governance and performance in Air Force, anything that Air Force might lead to Air Force failure, which was an interesting review. At the start of that, I ended up replacing Jack Plenty temporarily as Chief of Staff at Headquarters Australian Theatre at Potts Point. Right at the time, actually, we went into the war in 2003. So I was there with Mark Bonz's 2IC as the Chief of Staff, and it was a fantastic opportunity to do that. I came out of that, did the governance review for Angus and gave him the report and said, that's as best I can do. I can do longer, but it's not going to change the findings. Can I go back and do Hornet refresher? So I went back to start Hornet refresher, and I would have been about a month into the Hornet refresher in, would have been September, I guess, in 2003, September, October 2003. I have to have a look at the dates. And I got back on one Friday, and you look at the whiteboard at OCU as you walk back in and sign off the aeroplane, and up there it says, Binny, Air Commodore Binskin, ring Air Commander at 1400. And it was John Kindler. And I thought, that can't be good. And so 1400, I rang JK, and he said, I want you to go and do the CAOC, so the Combined Air and Space Operations Centre Director role in the Middle East. They've offered Australia a position as the Director, but I'd like you to go, and it's in 2 weeks' time. So canned refresher, went home, did all the initial training. It ended up in about 3 weeks, and went across. And again, worked for a fantastic boss over there. I ended up being the first dedicated director of the CAOC. Previously, they'd had a Brit, but they were shared roles with the US one star and the Brit one star. This was going to be the first dedicated one. And I went across and worked for a two-star by the name of Bob Elder, who was a B-52 pilot who had met John Kindler about 10 years before in a pitch black exercise. And so they knew each other, and they had worked up this coalition position in the Air and Space Operations Centre. So I arrived and stepped into the role, and there was a US Air Force one star there at the time, Bill Rue, call sign Kanga, who was sitting in the background. And I said, well, who's he? And he said, I used to see my one star. And about 3 days into the job, he actually went to Bob Elder and said, I'm wasted here, let's send me home. So I ended up, luckily enough, being the first dedicated non-US director of the Combined Air and Space Operations Centre. Yeah.
And some of your decisions, some of your roles in that position?
So you're not the air component commander, but you're orchestrating the air battle at the time. So it wasn't the major op, it was later on, but we were in Afghanistan, Iraq, and a couple other places. And so it was quite interesting at the time. Iraq was the main theatre, but we're probably only employing 30% of the weapons in Iraq. Afghanistan was at the time the forgotten part of it, and we're probably doing about 60 or 70% there. So I would, whenever a US congressman visited or whatever, I would be the one briefing them. They go, but you're an Australian. To which Bob Elder would say, yes, he's the director of the Combined or Coalition Air Operations Centre.
Be quiet and listen.
That's exactly right. So I got a chance to brief some pretty senior people, but the one thing that kept coming back, you'd put up the stats about what you were doing. There'd be probably 300 missions a day that we were responsible for orchestrating. And you'd show them where they were. Some were a lot, those tankers and intelligence and reconnaissance and some maritime, and a carrier would be in the Gulf and it would provide aircraft as well. But then you brief them and you talk about, we're probably doing 60, 70% in Iraq of flying, 30%, 40% in Afghanistan flying, but the weapons drops are the exact opposite. And they go, but I thought we won Afghanistan. You go, no. It's all you did was shift. And it was an interesting time because, as Karzai, at the time they were building the ring road around Afghanistan from Kabul and around. That was supposed to link the country a lot better. In Iraq, Fallujah was starting to become a word. And so it was a very interesting time. But it gave me a chance to have some access to some great air power and use it in different ways.
Surely, sorry to be rude and interrupt, surely it also gave you a skill set to deal with when you're Chief of Defence or Air Chief Marshal. You have acquired that skill set by having dealt with people where they said, but he's an Australian.
That's exactly right. And also a lot of people I was there with at that time all went up through the US ranks as well. So it gave me a chance to, in later life, the commander of Indo-PACOM Air Force in Hawaii, Cruiser Wilsback. He was the colonel that was there at the time. So it gave me some great access to people and friendships and building relationships. And Bob Elder was another one that was, again, a good leader and a good mentor that I've kept in touch with. But it gave a chance to use air power different ways. And I got a chance to use a nuclear bomber one day in a totally non-nuclear role, which was something else. And I've got to tell this story because it just shows you the flexibility you have to have. There was a lot of camps building these roads, and there was, I think it was Ghazni or one of those places where there was one of these itinerant worker camps, of which there were US personnel, defence personnel running them, but they had workers from around the world. And it was like the 26th or 27th of December. It was cold, it was snowing, and we got a phone call patched through from the CENTCOM headquarters to us from the head of one of these, the leader of one of these little working camps. And his basic story was, it's cold, it's wet, the food's bad, and the troops are about to revolt. Can you do something about it? We're really worried about what's going on here. And I looked up on the big board where we had aeroplanes, and we really only had one. It was a B-1 bomber in an orbit over just north of Kabul, just waiting for a tasking. And I looked at it and did a bit of measurement and said, tell you what, we'll be there in 20 minutes, stand by. And it's snowing and it's sleeting, and this guy goes out and he's trying to push back these people that are about to revolt because the food's bad. And he says, mark my words, if you don't listen to me, all hell will break loose. And about, as he said, all hell will break loose, a B-1 came over the top of 200 feet with all four afterburners out the back, out of the sleet, back into the sleet. And we got a phone call back about half an hour later who said, thanks, we'll be good for another month or two. They've all gone back to their huts. So it's a great chance to. It was a chance to do a lot of things, but some of those sorts of stories sort of stick in my mind as some of the light-hearted things. There was also a lot that wasn't light-hearted in that role, as you'd expect.
I hope you're going to write a book one day. Did you shoot down, see, or investigate UFOs?
Now we're back to the Mirage studs. One of the interesting things we did in Mirage, it would have been an August time frame, I can't remember if it was 1982 or 83, 83, probably just before I got married. Sydney Radar had picked up a contact, an unidentified contact that was heading sort of off the coast and moving out into the Pacific. And they weren't sure what it was. And then Duckhole Hill, the crew up there, thought they saw it as well. Once they did that, we had to go and investigate it. So they put the Mirages on alert at the end of the runway, and it was alert 2 back then. 2 minutes, within 2 minutes of alert, you've got to get airborne with supersonic tanks on it. That was about it. We asked, should we be armed? And they said, no, we're not going to arm you. We said, well, what happens if we find something here? I'll just wave. We're standing alert, and then some bright spark has an idea that the F-111's faster than a Mirage. So an F-111 arrives at Williamtown. So here we are out the back of the jet drawing intercept geometry in the dirt so that they know how they can do intercept geometry. And then we all sat alert. 2 days into this, someone realised what it was. And I can't remember the technical term, but it was one of the Qantas jets flying to Hawaii and there's a secondary return that moves at half the distance but twice the speed or something or other. So after all that, we all packed up and went back to the room. But the 77 sat UFO alert for a couple of days.
All right. So much for the trivia. And I know you're conscious for time, and I really have appreciated this opportunity to chat. You are now Chief of Defence. As Chief of Defence, you advise government officials or bureaucrats what is needed in the way of hardware or whatever. How difficult is it for a person, Chief of Defence, being in the Air Force, telling someone who is not in the Air Force, doesn't understand technology, this is what we need to buy, this is what we need to do, and they think, how difficult is that for you?
It is difficult because you've got to bring everyone along and you've got to understand the government's position and what the government's strategy is. And one thing I learned early on is government may not necessarily have a strategy. They have an idea what they want. But you soon discover that when they say do this or do that, actually you try and move back from not the how to do it, but what do you want? And then I discovered that the CDF and the Secretary spend a lot of time working with government and helping develop that strategy on exactly what they want to do with a particular situation or do more broadly. And then once you've worked that, then you go back to government with the how. So here's some options on how. Don't hold back on the advice and don't hold back on the risks and how you're going to manage it and the like. And so during the time I was there, we had MH17 in the Ukraine, which was that was 21 days into my tenure as CDF. That was a particularly interesting situation for a lot of reasons. One being where it was and how close it was to the Russian separatists at the time. And then very quickly after that, we were getting a phone call from Marty Dempsey, Binny, where we've got this group of people on a mountain called Mount Sinjar. There are a lot of Yazidis and they're in trouble. Do you think Australia will support dropping water and supplies? To which the answer was obviously yes. And then being able to comfortably pick up the phone and talk to the minister and have the minister go, get the submission to us quickly and we'll sign that off and we'll do it. To then counter ISIL, deploying Hornets, Wedgetail, a tanker within 3 weeks of the government making a decision to go. Actually deploying earlier than that, they were bombed up and operating over Iraq within 3 weeks, which is pretty impressive for the Air Force, to be honest with you. If you think about what it had to do and what the people in Air Force and Defence had to do to make that happen, I was actually a very proud Air Force officer when they did that. They did a fantastic job pulling together to make that all work. We couldn't have done that ourselves.
As Chief of Defence and Chief of Air Force, Air Chief Marshal, what would you pick out as one thing this I am most proud about?
I'm a fighter pilot.
Fantastic answer. Air Chief Marshal, retired Mark Binskin AC, this has been an honour and a privilege to be able to chat with you. I hope you've got as much out of it as I certainly have, and I hope a book is forthcoming sometime in the
Maybe down track. Hey, you brought back some great memories and actually a couple of sad memories as well. But I appreciate being able to talk to you, Gareth. Thank you very much.
The motto of the Air Force is Per Ardua ad Astra, through adversity to the stars. Achieving the Air Force's mission is dangerous and sometimes deadly. Untold numbers of Air Force personnel perish and are damaged physically and mentally in war, peacekeeping and civil emergencies. The Air Force Association's work is to provide these veteran aviators and their families with the necessary support services. If you can help with this vital work, please go to rafansw.org.au and look for the Help Us button.